We have 4 people present, so that's pleasant. Yesterday I promised to start with um, paragraph 409 of this book, Civilization in Transition, which is volume 9 of the collected works. And so that paragraph reads, long before 1933, there was a smell of burning in the air, and people were passionately interested in discovering the locus of the fire and in tracking down the incendiary. And when denser clouds of smoke were seen to gather over Germany, and the burning of the Reichstag gave the signal, then at last there was no mistake where the incendiary evil in person dwelt. Terrifying as this discovery was, in time it brought a sense of relief. Now we knew for certain where all unrighteousness was to be found, whereas we ourselves were securely entrenched in the opposite camp among respectable people whose moral indignation could be trusted to rise higher and higher with every fresh sign of guilt on the other side. Even the call for mass executions no longer offended the ears of the righteous, and the saturation bombing of German cities was looked upon as the judgment of God. Hate had found respectable motives and had ceased to be a personal idiosyncrasy, indulged in secret, and all the time the esteemed public had not the faintest idea how closely they themselves were living to evil. Now, one of the issues here is this one, the trouble with Darth Vader. And the trouble with Darth Vader is that we project him outward from ourselves, and we don't admit that it's part of us. And so when we have evil in our movies, it's always a bad guy. It's not us. We identify ourselves with the good guys, and unfortunately, we don't learn anything. And so let me see here. Okay. So in our normal lives, we do weigh up the motives of human action, and common sense prevails. Most of us live moral lives, and yet we know that there are certain scenarios that can cause a different result. This is why stories which show people weighing the moral alternatives we all face are useful in helping us know ourselves. The trouble with Darth Vader is he gave us the crutch of thinking that evil is outside and can be fought with a lightsaber. This is from an article I wrote on Archetype and Action website called Where is Darth Vader When We Need Him? And so, nice to see you, Jerome. Nice to see you, Mean Joe Hicks. Thoughts on evil being a distinct thing versus evil being an absence of good. Certainly, evil is a distinct thing. Dr. Jung believed that evil was very definitely a distinct thing, and let me see if I have that again. Okay. So here was the issue. I'm not sure when you came in, so allow me to put this up for you. See if I can get it in a better position. Okay, so Dr. Jung wrote this passage in the Red Book, and especially the last the last paragraph is extremely significant. He said, "Did you ever think of the evil in you? Oh, you spoke of it, you mentioned it, and you confessed it smilingly as a general human vice or a recurring misunderstanding. But did you know what evil is, and that it stands precisely behind your virtues? That it is also your virtues themselves as their inevitable substance? You locked Satan in the abyss for a millennium, and when the millennium had passed, you laughed at him, since he had become a children's fairy tale. But if the dreadful Great One raises his head, the world winces, the most extreme coldness draws near." I think this is a very important quote because what Dr. Jung is saying is that we didn't recognize that evil was a great power. We got the idea somehow that, somehow thanks to the church, that evil is simply the absence of good and that we could simply pile up good and everything would be hunky-dory. But that's not the case. And the result of thinking that was we had the 20th century, where Christian killed Christian and in very bloody ways, didn't hesitate to do it. So anyway, let's see. Jerome, based upon our developmental level of moral judgment, we consciously determine what is good from what is evil. I agree with that. If we encounter a perceived evil, we become irritated and unconsciously project that evil upon another. Absolutely true. That's extremely interesting. Thank you for posting these videos and live streams from Joe. Yes, thank you. Yeah, I have another quote here. I'm not sure I've quite finished preparing it for the screen, but let me look for it. Just see where I have this thing. Okay, I think this is it. So let me just pull it into here. So I'm going to take Satan off the screen for a moment and give you this one. So the most tremendous danger that man has to face is the power of his ideas. Mass infections are greater than man, and man is their victim. He shouts and parades and pretends that he is the leader, but he is really their victim. They're the uprush of earthly and spiritual forces from the depth of the psyche. Okay, so that's one idea. Let me see if I can destroy my studio here. So, this one here, not. Sorry, I need to take a moment here to create this other image. It's amazingly difficult to get all these things ready in the right order. Okay, so only an infantile person can pretend that evil is not at work everywhere. And the more unconscious he is, the more the devil drives him. It is just because of this interconnection with the black side of things that it is so incredibly easy for mass man to commit the most appalling crimes without thinking. Only ruthless self-knowledge on the widest scale, which sees good and evil in correct perspective and can weigh up the motives of human action, offers some guarantee that the end result will not turn out too badly. Okay, I think the point that Dr. Jung was making here is that, let's see if I can in some way get myself a little bit bigger here. The point is that good and evil are not definitive. They are opposites in the sense of the yin yang being opposites. And so when one man's good is another man's evil, obviously we have the United States divided into halves, red states and blue states, and obviously each of us has our own attitude about what is good and what is evil. But inevitably we have to make our own judgments. We can't be protected by society because sometimes things get out of whack, and so the more regulations we put on things, the more we're squeezed down by civilization. And when we're squeezed down by civilization, it becomes uncomfortable, and that's what we have seen erupt since 2016, in the election of 2016, and in the instinctual forces that erupted against all the regulation that people are feeling in their lives. Let's see. Okay, so Jerome, paraphrasing Mary Stein, if you assign a value to something as evil, you are casting out a lure. The ego is drawn in by the magnetism of God's need to incarnate his own dark destructiveness. Yes, absolutely. Once we identify something as evil, we posit good on the other side, and once we posit good, we posit evil on the other side. And our psyche operates, our psychic energy comes from the opposites, as Dr. Jung pointed out. If we don't have those opposites, we become stale and as inert as stones. I wonder if I had that. Let's see if this is here. Okay, here's one quote from Dr. Jung that addresses this, but there was another one. I don't seem to have it prepared as yet. was, well, what I was thinking of was the quote from Esther Harding, which said that we originated in the primeval swamps, and gradually we as human beings build up civilization, culture, and so on. And but we still are animals. We still have many of the instincts of all animals, and as a result, that's where we get our psychic energy. That's how we move about in the world. And without that, we become inert. And so we have to have this competition, and this is actually where the dynamism of the United States comes from, because we do allow debate. And, only once in the Civil War did we have it break out an actual battle against one another. But otherwise, we battle it out in legislatures and in the newspapers and wherever it is. And so the result is we've managed to select the best things that come up in people's ideas, and we run the worst things out of the system. And we've become the envy of the world. That's why there are people from every country who want to come here. I don't think we could say that about any other country, that there are people from every country that are seeking to become Americans. And that's in part because of the idea that, or at least I believe it's because we are the essence of the human spirit allowed to rise to its highest level. I might be wrong, but that's a position that I've taken for a few years. And so, Jerome, I agree with you that it is God's need to incarnate his own dark destructiveness, and that's covered in Ion, in chapter 4 of Ion, which you can find on this channel in the reading of Ion and the reading of Dr. Edward Edinger's book, The Ion Lectures, which I've been reading in tandem with Ion. So the first 4 lectures of Ion, the first 4 chapters of Ion have been put into the channel, and those represent the levels of consciousness. And I think I might have that here. I hope so. Yeah, here we go. Okay, so this is a diagram that Dr. Edward Edinger did, which I believe is in chapter 2 of the Ion Lectures. And what he's showing us here is the layers of the psyche. And the deepest layer is the layer that Jungian analysts call the self. And they also call it the God image and a lot of other things, transpersonal self, etc., etc. And so the point is that the point from Jungian analysts, when we talk about God, is the self is part of us, but there also is a metaphysical God. There are 2 ways of thinking about it. One is a theological way of thinking about it. One is a psychological way of thinking about it. And what's significant is that the psychologists don't claim to have a metaphysical answer on God, but they do claim to know what's going on in the self, the so-called God image. And so whenever we're talking about God in around Jungian psychology, we're all talking about the deepest archetype within the human personality, and that is the self. So in this image, we have at the top, Dr. Jung wrote the book Ion in the order in which we experience our psyche in life. And so chapter 1 is the ego, that's the top layer, and you can see a woman's ego there and a man's ego. And then from the ego, you see the the shadow coming down through, which is goes down all the way to the self, and that is chapter 2. And chapter 3 is what Dr. Jung calls the syzygy, which means a yoked together entity that is the anima and the animus. We have both in our psyches, but men tend to have anima and women tend to have animus, but we also have a bit of the other in ourselves. Has nothing to do per se with physical gender. And then the 4th chapter is the self, and it's the self at different layers, going back first to the personal self and going deeper and deeper into the self as it appears in the universe. I don't know if that's helpful, but the point is that whenever you have so-called good out there in the world, then there will be a reaction to that in other people. Okay, other people will have a different point of view, and that always happens. It's unavoidable, and so that's why Dr. Jung is saying, well, we hope that the outcome isn't too bad. So let's see. Could I give some examples about how the anima and animus manifests itself? Well, yes, I certainly can. For men, and I can only mostly give it from the anima perspective, but I accept the concept that the animus works more or less the same way in the opposite direction. But from a man's point of view, the anima is that part of you that says, wow, this woman is for me. And so we run into women all the time in our daily life, but every so often your psyche says, wow, I want that one. And that works real well when you're in your late teens or early 20s, because in the United States at least we have love marriages, so you can see the woman that decapitates you, and then you can court her and persuade her to marry you, and the anima is operating throughout the honeymoon stage. Then about 6 or 8 weeks into your marriage, you wake up one fine morning and the anima isn't projected on this woman that's lying next to you, because now you've learned some things about her that you didn't know, and they might be things that you didn't particularly like, but you didn't care about back when the anima was possessing you. But as you live with someone for a short period of time, you start to see their flaws, and the problem is that now you're married to this person, and your anima is still out there looking for the ideal mate for you. And this happens all the time. It's still happening to me at age 71, but fortunately, now I know when my anima grabs me, I can say, I know that's the anima, and I have to control that. But I think a lot of marriages break up in the United States because we haven't taught our children that fact, because your body is doing things all the time in a certain way. It it beats your heart 72 times a minute. It makes you breathe 12 times a minute. You have a life force that tells you don't want to die. And none of those things change through your lifetime, except for slings and arrows of life, let's say. And your anima and animus are both operating in the same way, and they don't stop just because you had a wedding ceremony. So if you're mature enough and you've been taught that this is the way this is going to be, and the task once you marry a person is to work a relationship with that person. And in Jungian terms, we talk about building a rebus, which is something that only you know. I mean, there's a old Billy Joel song, I think, but I did not make a graphic of it, but I think I have the quote here, which is that Billy Joel was breaking up with Christy Brinkley, and he was very sad about it. And let's see if I can find that quote here just a minute. So the quote is, I think the song is called "You're the Only One Who Knows," and the chorus goes like this: "So I would choose to be with you, that's if the choice were mine to make, but you can make decisions too, and you can have this heart to break. And so it goes, and so it goes, and you're the only one who knows." And so the point is that when you have a marriage, you share things with your spouse that you don't and can't share with anyone else in various ways. I mean, it's not only sexuality, but the joys and heartaches of raising children, and all kinds of things happen to you in a marriage, and you have to work your way through that, and it builds a certain connection or not between you, but usually it builds a connection, let's say, and that connection is a rebus. It's a alchemical vase in the sense of alchemy, according to Dr. Jung. And so, but the anima is busy still looking for another mate for you. And the opposite is true for the animus, I believe. And let's see. I hope that helps. It's a very complicated area. And if you listen to Chapter 3 of Ion, which I've read into the YouTube channel, and to Dr. Edinger's commentary on Chapter 3, you can get it in much greater detail. Let's see. Does the self have a shadow? Very definitely. I think the point is that we're always trying to integrate, and a fully individuated person would be a person who's integrated the conscious with the shadow at the deepest level. That would be an objective of individuation. Uh, Peter Barrett says, "Can you expand on this quote from Jung in Collected Work 9.1?" Okay, you're going to have to give me the quote. Is it there? Only when all props and crutches are broken and no cover from the rear offers even the slightest hope of security does it become possible for us to experience an archetype. That up till then had lain hidden behind the meaningful nonsense played out by the Anima. This is the archetype of meaning, just as the Anima is the archetype of life itself. Um, well, you know, I'm struggling with this a bit, Peter, because um, it's such a complex area, and uh, there's a lot of um, videos on the YouTube channel about anima and animus. It's not something I can sort of wrap up in a couple of sentences here, but archetypes are um, are like programming. Okay, and think of it as a record that's going to play, and it's going to play through, and uh, so in the it's also an instinct. So in the if you think of the anima as a instinct, it's mainly the I would say it's mainly the archetype that has you find a mate, and and the animus also. And the problem is that that archetype just keeps playing and keeps trying to have you mate, and that's not necessarily good for society when we're always trying to mate with some other person, and meanwhile we have to build this rebus with the woman or the man that we married, and that's where maturity comes in. Um, let's see. What are the origins of anima? Is it based off of characteristics of our parents, or is it something else? Okay, let's say that we are born with a certain functionality. We have our DNA, our heart is beating, we're breathing, we're crying and asking for food, and so on. And so onto that basic template, let's call it a blank slate of a human being, we learn certain things. And one of them, in the case of anima, the first thing that we learn is that mother is going to feed us. And so I know for me, my anima is always looking for a dark haired woman with long hair, more than shoulder length hair. And the reason for that is that when I was very young, that's what my mother had. And my father had a picture of her drawn by an artist in Greece, I believe, in 1947. And it had her as a high school student with long brown hair. And so every time I see a woman with long brown hair, oh my God, my anima just takes off to the races. And it very often happens. Um, and so, yes, it does come from our parents, and the same for fathers for girls. I mean, my I had one failed marriage. It didn't fail immediately. We were together for 17 years. Um, but girls tend to have an image of their father or father figure in their psyche. And, uh, in my view, my ex wife expected me to be her father, which is not what I was going to be. Because I'm not a handyman. It turns out I'm allergic to everything that's green and grows. You wonder how I made it through 23 years in the Marines, but anyway, I did. And but I really detest doing the honeydew list and cutting grass and that sort of thing. And that's what she expected and wanted, and she wanted me to take over and be her daddy and take care of every little thing, and I couldn't. I could not never do that for her, and so after we divorced, and I still love her. We still have a very good relationship after all these years, more than 30 years that we've been separated now. But she married another man that was 10 years her senior, and presumably matched her animus more than I did. I know I've seen him many times riding a tractor cutting the grass, which is something that I would never want to do. But anyway, and so yes, she was projecting her animus on him, and and my anima just, as I say, takes off to the races every time I see a woman with long, more than shoulder length hair. And then, but fortunately, because I know something about Jungian psychology, I say, aha, I know what you're up to in their psyche, and I'm not going to let you ruin my life again. Anyway, and so about all the props and crutches being broken, I think that we see evidence. I had prepared a meme, but I didn't quite have time to get it prepared for this session. But the part of what I wanted to talk about is how good and evil play out in mass psychoses. And we had an excellent example of that in World War II, because once it started, once Hitler had cooked up the German people, and once Tojo had cooked up the Japanese people and got these mass psychoses going, there was no stopping it until all the crockery was broken. And I know something about Japan, quite a bit about Japan, because I lived there for 8 years, and I know that had it not been for the atom bomb, that there would have had to be an invasion of the main island of Honshu in Japan, and the Japanese were actually training 15-year-old girls with spears made out of bamboo to fight off the Americans. And that was the extent to which they were willing to go to fight and not surrender. And so both in Germany and in Japan, basically all the crockery had to be broken. And in Japan, Tokyo was leveled. Yokohama was essentially leveled. There was one building left in Yokohama at the end of the war, and it was a stucco building that had been a hospital, and it had a red cross painted on top of it so we didn't bomb it. And that turned out to be my high school building when I was in the 10th to the 12th grade. And it was the last building that survived in Yokohama. But besides that, these cities were totally leveled. The only thing that wasn't leveled in Tokyo was the Diet Building, which is their parliament, and the Imperial Palace. We didn't attack the emperor. But and so these archetypes, once they start playing, whatever it is, like the archetype of mother, I mean, once you become a mother, you're a mother, and that archetype is going to keep playing the parts of itself right through your life. It's not going to stop. And what Dr. Jung refers to this as constellation. So all of these things are potentialities in the psyche, let's say, and they get activated at some point. But once they get activated, they don't stop. They're going to play through to the end. Okay. And so this is part of what Dr. Jung was addressing when he talked about all the props and crutches being broken. If an archetype has to be stopped, it's not going to be stopped until it's finished playing one way or another. Let's see. The archetype of meaning, I'm not so sure. I don't remember that phrase, but if you're quoting directly from Volume 9, Part 1, I suppose. I mean, the important thing to know is that we can't live our lives without meaning. If we have meaning in our life, then we can handle almost anything. But if we don't see any meaning in our life, then it's almost not worth living. And a lot of people commit suicide because they can't find meaning in their lives. And so one thing I urge you to do, if whoever is watching this, is to make sure that you have meaning in your life one way or another. What is the meaning of your life? Why are you living today? Why am I living today? Ask yourself that question every single day. And as you see from the nearly 500, or I guess it's now over 500 videos that are on the YouTube channel, somehow Dr. Jung constellated something in me. And I feel very strongly, number one, that Dr. Jung has helped me in my life very much in the way a therapist might do. And also he's helped me have a very broad perspective on current events, so that I was able to write a book, for example, called Political Psychology, New Ideas for Activists, which you can have free if you are a member of our Dropbox. And I'm not selling anything in this exercise of running this YouTube channel. And so that archetype of, I think of it as the archetype of Hermes or Mercury, the god from Greek tradition who went into the underworld being the unconscious, and brought back things for people to assimilate into their lives. And that archetype of Hermes is very strongly playing in me, and also the archetype of Hephaestus, who in Roman tradition was Vulcan, the man at the forge. And that is, you see that archetype playing in me because I'm building something and have been building things all of my life. I built a company that went public in 2005, and for example, and since 2010 I built the Archetype in Action website, and you'll find more than 3,500 articles on that site that I put there. And so that's the Hephaestus archetype playing through me. And you also see it in the building of this YouTube channel. And then the discussion that I have with people online, as we are right now, is me playing the Hermes or Mercury archetype. Um, so Arcadian Wings says I'm going to do an elaborate video on Animus sometime next week. That'll be great. I look forward to seeing that. And you and I need to talk about that and some of the other video issues. But anyway, that's not for this discussion here. Um, and, I do talk to people privately from time to time. I'm not a therapist, and I don't hold myself out as a mental health professional, but I certainly am prepared to talk to people offline in places where they don't have to discuss issues with the world. I'm not going to offer mental health advice. I'm not going to interpret any dreams except my own. I might interpret my own as examples, but anyway, let's see. I had some other quotes. I'm not sure. I think that okay. One of the things I wanted to talk about is white magic and black magic. And I think I did manage to get that meme put together. And so let me put that up on the screen. And it's pretty big, but I'll just put it there in front of my face for the moment so that you can read it, and I'll read it to you, because this has everything to do with political psychology. Okay, so this quote says, there can be no doubt that the unconscious comes to the surface and with its dynamism destroys the orderliness that is characteristic of consciousness. This process is a phenomenon that can be observed in more or less developed form in all epochs. At the present day, such things are obviously taking place on the largest scale because the cultural order has suppressed the primitive disorderliness too long and too violently. This was from a letter written in 1952 by Dr. Jung. The uprushing chaos seeks new symbolic ideas which will embrace and express not only the previous order, but also the essential contents of the disorder. Such ideas would have a magical effect by holding the destructive forces of disorder spellbound. In ancient tradition, this magic is called white magic. Black magic, on the other hand, exalts the destructive forces into the only valid truth in contrast to the previous order, and moreover compels them to serve the individual in contrast to the collective. The means used for this purpose are primitive, fascinating, and awe-inspiring ideas and images, unintelligible incantations, outlandish words and shapes, savage rhythms, drumming, and such like. Now, I'll leave it to you to interpret how this applies to our political world right now. But what is clear to me, and let me now move that off the screen so that I can be seen again. But I do have a symbol for our solution, and it's a question of just a change of attitude. We currently have a terrible duality of opposites in our political structure in the United States. And almost to the extent that many of us fear that it could actually destroy the country. Um, and I think that there's a different way to look at it, and that is that uh, we need to, if we're Americans, we need to go outside and see that the country runs, it works. And we have every nationality among our American citizens. We have every religion, every cultural background, um, every political idea under the sun, and many more, in a sense. And um, what makes us unique is that we debate these issues ad infinitum. And only once in the Civil War did it erupt into an actual warfare, but otherwise, pretty much our debates have controlled it, and our society has been strong enough to to maintain its cohesion, even though we have serious debate. And a couple of weeks ago, I was doing this. I was doing this other thing. So let me see. Okay, so here is an example. Okay, we had the Women's March a couple weeks back, and it went off. As far as I know, there was no violence in it, but obviously, we have a lot of angry people right now who are ready to get up and demonstrate that they're not happy with the current political situation in our country. And but the thing about it is, after that demonstration was over, everybody went home and went on with their lives. And if we look around, we mostly see peace almost everywhere. I'm not saying we don't have eruptions from time to time. We certainly do. We have these massive shootings and so on. But in the greater scheme of things, those are relatively minor compared to the fact that we pretty much live in peace most of the time. Now, we do have wall to wall news coverage right now, so we have the sense that these things are, these bad things are happening all the time everywhere, but that's not the case. And, one of the big problems about 9/11 was that young people, children, were seeing these images over and over and over again, and even today they're still seeing them, and they don't necessarily understand the context that this was one event that occurred on one day in September of 2001, and now it's over. And meanwhile, we've built a new World Trade Center to replace it, and it's taller than the other one. So the point is that we have a society here that maintains its cohesion, even though we have a lot of dispute. And the other example is Gezi Park, and so that's Turkey, and the demonstrations that went on in, I believe, what was it, 2013, that they were demonstrations against the destruction of trees in central Istanbul, and those were obviously very violent, especially on the part of the government. And the upshot of it was that about a year ago there was an attempted coup d'etat in Turkey, and I don't think the yayas are out of the system in that country yet. But our debate makes it so that it's a process like tempering steel, in the sense that we pound all the impurities out of the system, and we keep what's good and get rid of what's bad. I mean, obviously, the worst idea that we had in this country was slavery, And we're still suffering the impact of having that system in our country today, even though it's been illegal in this country for over 150 years. But we're still suffering the repercussions. Nonetheless, um, things are vastly changed. I mean, when I went to um, when I finished college and went on active duty in the Marine Corps, I came to the Washington area because I was going to the basic school at Quantico. And at that time, there was Resurrection City on the mall between the Lincoln Memorial and the Washington Monument. And uh, there was lots and lots of trouble between blacks and whites. And the day that I reported for active duty, 4 Marine officers had been to a celebration down at Quantico, and they were in their dress blue uniforms. They came up to Washington and went to a bar, walked in the bar, and so they're there in dress blue uniforms, and somebody came in and just shot them all dead, shot 4 of them dead. Okay, so that's the way things were in the late 1960s. And at that time, uh, I could not walk safely east of the Supreme Court uh, on Capitol Hill. But years later, in 1986, I moved to Washington to be with my current wife, and we lived 12 blocks east of the Supreme Court for 10 years. And it was mostly safe, not perfectly safe, but it was much different from the way things were before that. And I think about my experience in high school, or I'm sorry, junior high school. I lived in Norfolk, Virginia, and at that time, this was 1957, there was a big dust up over integration of the schools, thanks to Brown versus Board of Education, the case that was decided in 1954 by the Supreme Court. And so the governor of Virginia, whose name was Almond, Governor Almond closed all the schools in Virginia for a year to prevent integration. And so my school in Norfolk was scheduled to have 1 black girl go to the 7th grade. She would have been in my class. Um, but we never got to start the year. And so that was sort of the beginning of the big civil rights movement at that time. My parents were in the Navy, so fortunately we moved away from Norfolk and went to Philadelphia, where I could have a normal junior high school experience before going to Japan. But there was a lot of bad feeling at that time, a lot of very, very strenuous debate. And I'm not saying that it's over, it's not over, but things are much, much better than they were back then. And we do have a tendency in this country to correct our errors. As Winston Churchill once said, Americans can be relied upon to always make the right decision after they've tried everything else. And so, fair enough. I mean, the fact is we do try. And the things that we find that don't work, we push out of the system, and the things that do work, everybody in the world adopts. So anyway, I'm repeating myself from other videos, so I don't want to bore you. But anyway, all of these things have obviously psychological impact. So at this point, because I didn't manage to get all these things that I wanted to show you put into the system so that I could put them on the screen for you, I'll be happy to answer any other question that you might have on Dr. Jung's work. But otherwise, I'll draw this to a conclusion at this point, and I'll try to plan better for the next session. I guess I did want to read a couple more paragraphs of this section from Civilization in Transition. I don't think I've covered evil at all sufficiently yet, and I thought that this morning I could find a bunch of quotes and get them ready for the screen, but that proved to be a big technical issue, so it took a long time to prepare them. But anyway, let me read on in paragraph 410. One should not imagine for a moment that anybody could escape this play of opposites. Even a saint would have to pray unceasingly for the souls of Hitler and Himmler, the Gestapo and the SS, in order to repair without delay the damage done to his own soul. The sight of evil kindles evil in the soul. There is no getting away from this fact. The victim is not the only sufferer. Everybody in the vicinity of the crime, including the murderer, suffers with him. Something of the abysmal darkness of the world has broken in on us, poisoning the very air we breathe and befouling the pure water with the stale, nauseating taste of blood. True, we are innocent. We are the victims, robbed, betrayed, outraged, and yet for all that, or precisely because of it, the flame of evil glowers in our moral indignation. It must be so, for it is necessary that someone should feel indignant, that someone should let himself be the sword of judgment wielded by fate. Evil calls for expiation, otherwise the wicked will destroy the world utterly, or the good suffocate in their rage, which they cannot vent, and in either case, no good will can come of it. Paragraph 411. When evil breaks at any point into the order of things, our whole circle of psychic protection is disrupted. Action inevitably calls up reaction, and in the matter of destructiveness, this turns out to be just as bad as the crime, and possibly even worse, because the evil must be exterminated root and branch in order to escape the contaminating touch of evil. I guess I didn't pronounce that well. In order to escape the contaminating touch of evil, we need a proper right of sortie, right of exit, a solemn admission of guilt by judge, hangman, and public, followed by an act of expiation. So I'll stop this particular reading there, but you can see how strongly Dr. Jung felt about this after the war. Right, Jerome, thank you for bringing that to everyone's attention. I actually don't have that particular book. I have many others, a whole book, full-size bookcase of them, but evil is a great power in Dr. Jung's point of view, and we need to be very conscious of it and where it is. We need to make the right decisions. We have to weigh things in our own minds because any change has to come in our own minds. And so just to close out this video, I'm going to put back on the screen this quote about white and black magic, because unfortunately from where I sit, I think we have some serious black magic going on in this country, and either we recognize it as evil, or we may destroy the republic, because if we can't have the rule of law, or if the rule of law is threatened, we're in serious, serious trouble. And so I'll just put that on the screen and shut up, but I'm going to let it play for a minute or two just to close out the video. So I'll say the end and goodbye, and if anyone wants to throw in a last-minute question before I turn off the live feed, please do, and I'll be happy to answer. But otherwise, I'm going to mute my mic for now.